Signed Stark by Ben Elton, a blog post written and narrated by Robert Fairhead from the Tall and True writers website. In October 2017, I attended a premiere screening of Ben Elton's Three Summers. After the film, there was a Q&A session with the writer-director Ben and lead actor Michael Caton. As I commented in a film review, shared on Tall and True, I have admired Ben's work since watching him do stand-up comedy on TV in England in 1987. I also love the hit TV series he co-wrote in the 1980s and 1990s, The Young Ones and Blackadder. And I have enjoyed reading his novels, from Stark in 1989 to Time and Time Again in 2014. So it was a great privilege to meet Ben in person after the Q&A, and to have him sign my yellowed copy of Stark 30 years after I first fell in love with his work. Back in 1989, environmental awareness and eco-protests were on the rise. World leaders were forced by scientific and public opinion to finally ban the chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which had created a continental-sized hole in the ozone layer. And there was growing recognition of how humanity was trashing the planet and that we have no planet B. The planet had also plunged into economic disaster, with the 1987 Black Monday stock market crash triggering worldwide recessions. And yet, among our rulers and the moneyed class, Gordon Gekko's greed is good maxim seemed to hold sway over the cries of, "What the heck are we doing to our planet?" Starting with Stark in 1989 and followed by Gridlock, 1991, and This Other Eden, 1993, Ben created an eco-novel genre of his own. His trademark combination of keen observation and scientific insight and sharp wit and writing skills held a blowtorch to the bloated belly of capitalism and its siblings, corporate excess and environmental vandalism. Ben spoke to my broadening late 20s mind. He encouraged me to act and argue for our pale blue dot in the inky universe. And I often quoted passages from Ben's eco-novels in my arguments. The closing paragraph of Stark has burned into my soul, a sad, searing summary of humanity. I mentioned this to Ben when he signed my copy of Stark. However, after writing 15 novels, numerous TV comedies, 2 musicals, and 2 films, it was hardly surprising he didn't remember the paragraph. And so I had the pinch myself honour of reading it to him. No spoilers, you'll have to read it for yourself in Stark. I don't know how Ben felt about those last lines after all this time, but rereading them sent the same tingle up my spine as when I first read Stark back in 1989. I also reminded Ben of a comment he'd made in the Q&A, how he'd been a POM looking into Australia in 1988. He was on a tour down under with fellow comedian Rick Mail and fell in love with the bass player of their backing band. And this led to Ben staying and setting his debut novel, Stark, in Western Australia. Having spent the past 30 years in Australia with his wife and kids, he said he felt like an Aussie when writing and directing Three Summers. "It's an Australian film with an Australian cast and crew," Ben said with pride, but he kindly agreed to jot that early POM quote in my 30-year-old copy of Stark. For Robert. This was written by a POM looking in 1988. Okay, so Ben and I didn't save the planet in the 1990s, and the existential threat of climate change has replaced the fears of toxic air and water pollution that pervaded his eco-novels. And yet, despite the scientific evidence, there are skeptics, deniers, and the uber-rich who would have us carry on as always, preaching growth is good, just as Ben warned in Stark and his other eco-novels. It has me wondering if it's because they've got an escape plan, as Ben envisaged. They've found a planet B, to which we, the ordinary people, won't be invited. We've reached an age where people and planets are as disposable as our gadgets. Perhaps it's time for me to reread Ben's signed copy of Stark and to start arguing and acting again for our pale blue dot. Hi, I'm Robert Fairhead from Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True writers website. I attended the Sydney premiere of Ben Elton's Three Summers in October 2017. Afterwards, I shared a film review on Tall and True and later wrote this blog post. As mentioned in the post, I had admired Ben's work since watching him do stand-up comedy on TV in England in 1987, and I loved the hit TV series he co-wrote in the 1980s and 1990s, The Young Ones and Blackadder. And I'd enjoyed reading his novels from Stark in 1989 to Time and Time Again in 2014. My brother was the first assistant director on Three Summers and attended the premiere with me, and after the film and Q&A, he introduced me to Ben. It was a surreal moment. Had anyone told me watching Ben on TV in 1987 that one day I'd meet him, I'd have thought they were mad, and yet there I was, shaking his hand. Of course, Ben was very popular on the night, and it wasn't until towards the end of the evening I plucked up the courage to ask him to sign my copy of Stark. I mentioned to Ben how his eco-novels had encouraged me to act and argue for the environment, and that I'd often quoted from them, especially the closing lines from Stark. And this resulted in the pinch-myself honour of reading to Ben his searing indictment of humanity. It's 4 years since I wrote this blog post, and 32 years since I read Stark. Who would have imagined back then the present-day spectre of a global environmental disaster, while billionaires blast into space? Ben Elton, that's who. Thanks for listening to this episode of Tall and True Short Reads. You can read all my short stories, blog posts and other writing at tallandtrue.com. You can also buy my short story collections from the Amazon Kindle and Kobo online bookstores. The next episode of Tall and True Short Reads will appear in your podcast feed shortly. In the meantime, don't forget to check your feed or the podcast website, tallandtrueshortreads.com, for earlier episodes from Season 1 and 2, and follow or subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it via your favourite listening app. Doing so helps other listeners find my writing. And finally, please support this podcast by telling your family and friends about Tall and True Short Reads and the Tall and True Writers website.